Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast that I call Through the Bible in 10 Years. Today we want to finish up 2 Thessalonians. Now, we've spent the last 3 weeks looking at the 3 chapters of 2 Thessalonians. And today I want to finish up 2 Thessalonians by talking about its background. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to some people because a lot of times you'll do the background before you start the letter. And that makes sense when you have a good sense of what the background of the letter is, or of the book is. But when you aren't quite sure what's going on, and you want to be inductive about it, I find that it's better to wait until the end to try to gather your thoughts. That is, to go through the text with a fine-tooth comb, and then when you get finished, collect the evidence that you've gathered, and try to construct a sense of what's probably going on. And then, of course, you could go back through the letter again then, and maybe have a more refined understanding. Now, if you've known my thinking for very long, and I hate to disappoint you, but I don't actually find tradition to be a completely trustworthy kind of thing. Now, this doesn't apply so much to 2 Thessalonians, but the 4 Gospels, for example, are technically anonymous because none of them actually internally say who their authors are. Same thing actually for the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch internally doesn't say who its author is. And I find that human traditions tend to have a kernel of truth to them, but they also tend to gravitate toward the word that comes to mind is the sensational, the famous. We assume the more renowned person is the author, or the more dramatic background. Sometimes the background for Psalms or various things is probably not that exciting, not as exciting as when we find some story in the life of David to pin the Psalm to. Well, I'm getting out of hand here. When I wrote a book on Hebrews, it was called Understanding the Book of Hebrews. I followed this approach. I waited until the last chapter of that book to begin to speculate about what the situation behind Hebrews is, because of course Hebrews again is anonymous. We don't know who the author of Hebrews was. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority, virtually the unanimous consent of scholarship. There's maybe one scholar who's very much out an outlier. Who might think that Paul wrote Hebrews, but the overwhelming majority of experts on Hebrews do not think that Paul wrote Hebrews, even though we don't know who wrote Hebrews. And so it seemed appropriate in that case to wait until after going through all of Hebrews to have a chapter on the situation. By the way, I've already changed my mind on the date of Hebrews since I wrote that book, Understanding the Book of Hebrews. I've since come to a different kind of conclusion, which is either a testament to my instability. I'd rather think that it's actually a testament to the fact that we just don't know for sure about Hebrews. Now, that's a big preface, and I apologize for beating around the bush. You might say 2 Thessalonians is obvious, isn't it? Isn't 2 Thessalonians obvious? And maybe it is. Let me give you scenario number 1. This is the nice one. This is the X marks the spot look at 2 Thessalonians. This approach basically assumes that what you see is what you get, and I'm not opposed to that. In fact, in my New Testament introduction, I assume that, and I've not written a lot on 2 Thessalonians, but what little I've written or blogged about 2 Thessalonians, I've generally followed scenario number 1. Although for years I've had this gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach that I'm going to. I shared a little bit the last 2 weeks about it, and I'm going to kind of condense it here. But 2 Thessalonians is actually the most enigmatic writing in the whole New Testament to me. It's the one writing that I've not really had a solidified perspective on it. But let me give you the nice scenario. This may very well be correct. I'm not opposed to it, and I like it in some respects. I just have had this gnawing feeling that it doesn't quite fit the evidence of the letter. But let's do the easy scenario. So this is the easy scenario. First, the Thessalonians, they received the letter of First Thessalonians. So if you remember from the podcast that we did on First Thessalonians, Paul founded the church at Thessalonica along with Silas and Timothy, but they weren't able to stay very long. They were probably there somewhere in between 1 and 2 months, and then they were forced out of town. And Paul's very worried that the church may not have actually had enough grounding to take off. And so when they're all at Athens, Paul and Silas send Timothy back to Thessalonica to check up on them. And then they go on to Corinth. And when Timothy arrives back at Corinth, he has a good report. The Thessalonians are still believers. They are solid in the faith, but they have a few questions. For example, maybe someone who had become a Christian under Paul's ministry had since died. And although they understood that Jesus was coming back to set up his kingdom on earth and that the judgment was coming, they understood all that. Paul hadn't really taught them about what happens to the dead in Christ. That is, what happens to those who die, who believed on Jesus, who die before Christ returns. And thus Paul writes 1 Thessalonians, and he sends 1 Thessalonians back to Thessalonica with Timothy. And in 1 Thessalonians, as we saw, he basically says the dead in Christ are going to be part of the kingdom of God. In fact, they will rise first and meet the Lord, and then we will meet him in the air, and then we will all come back, I infer, to participate in the judgment and in the setting up of the kingdom of God, and of that kingdom there shall be no end. And so that's 1 Thessalonians. Great. And in 1 Thessalonians, in chapter 5, Paul talks about how the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. That those who aren't ready won't expect it. Now, on the normal hypothesis, on the kind of the standard hypothesis about 1 Thessalonians, some of them overreact. Some of them think the day of the Lord, it's coming, it's coming, it's like a thief, it's coming. Has it already started? Has it already started? I mean, it takes a while for news to get here. Is this the beginning? We're undergoing persecution. Is this the beginning of birth pains? Is the judgment beginning with the house of God, as 1 Peter says, and it'll get to the rest of the world? Is the day of the Lord already starting? That's the one aspect. And also, maybe some of them stop working. Because let's face it, I always tell my students this when I teach 2 Thessalonians. If you know that Christ is coming back before the final exam, are you going to study for the final exam? I don't think so. Or if you know that at the end of the workday, Christ is coming back, are you going to go to work? I'm not sure I would. If you know a meteor is going to hit the earth, are you going to, keep cleaning that toilet at work, or whatever? You know what I'm saying? And so perhaps this would explain why some are idle in 2 Thessalonians 3. Again, this may very well be the right scenario. And so according to the traditional and usual, I don't know if it's traditional, but in terms of the kind of the typical introduction to 2 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians would be a second letter from Paul, Silas, and Timothy to the Thessalonians, written from Corinth, while Paul and Silas and Timothy were on the second missionary journey of Paul, around the year AD 51. And this would assume that the order of the books, 1 Thessalonians and then 2 Thessalonians, even though they're in the canon in that order because of their length, 1 Thessalonians is 5 chapters, 2 Thessalonians is only 3 chapters, that by happy fortune, that actually is the right order. 1 Thessalonians was written first, and 2 Thessalonians was written second. And of course, I agree with that. This is the standard hypothesis, and it's a good one. Maybe I should stop there. Ken, please stop there. This is fine, and this may be right. However, there are some curious things, and I'm just going to share this because I'm actually interested in the truth. And that's a thing I think sometimes we like, well, why would you question that? Because I'm interested in the truth, because I want to know what's true. And we like traditions. We don't like, I fear change. We don't like things to be questioned. Now, I'm not saying that what I'm about to hypothesize is right, I'm just saying there have always been some things about Second Thessalonians that I have found curious, and they've made me wonder. So, for example, why doesn't Second Thessalonians feel as personal and relational as First Thessalonians? And I think sometimes when you're not really in the weeds of these writings, you don't notice it. I mean, let's be honest, most Christians don't read the biblical text in a contextual way anyway. And so when you're not used to reading them in context, you maybe don't notice that Second Thessalonians uh, doesn't. The word hollow isn't right. That's not the right word. But Second Thessalonians doesn't feel as intimate as First Thessalonians does. It doesn't have the details of relationship, in my opinion. And I'm not the first to suggest this, not at all. It feels more formal in some respects, and more demanding, less. It's just not. It's not like you're having coffee with Paul in Second Thessalonians. It feels much more like Paul's preaching from a pulpit, and you're sitting listening to him. If that makes any sense. Well, okay, and so that's kind of curious. Why suddenly it's a little bit? Why does it feel a little bit more distant than First Thessalonians? Another curious thing is it's very similar, as we saw this when we did First Thessalonians 1 and a little bit in chapter 2. Why is it so similar? The greeting is very similar. And it's almost like it's using First Thessalonians as the template to write Second Thessalonians. Now, is there a problem with this? No, there's no problem with this at all. It's just when Paul is freewheeling his writing, it doesn't come out that way. You know what I'm saying? When Paul is just spontaneously writing, and of course, don't get me wrong, letters tended to be planned out. But why does Second Thessalonians follow some of the content and form? It has a second Thanksgiving in chapter 2. I think it's 2:13. In First Thessalonians 2:13, a second Thanksgiving begins. And by a coincidence, in Second Thessalonians 2:13, a second Thanksgiving begins. Why is there such a formal similarity in some respects, and yet quite different in other respects? It's just curious. It could mean nothing. I don't know if you know this, but well, of course you don't know this. Sometimes when so I've created some proposals for degrees in my day, and in fact we just had 4 Associate of Science degrees passed at Houghton College, where I'm at, on Thursday in the faculty meeting. Come get a degree, Associate of Science in Business and Criminal Justice and Psychology, Music Industry. Anyway, I didn't draft those 4 proposals from scratch. I didn't draft one and then say, well, I'm going to start completely from scratch on the second one. No, once I had the first proposal done, it didn't take me but a few minutes to draft the other 4 because they all follow the same template. So there'd be nothing wrong with Paul or Silas or Timothy get out a copy of First Thessalonians and then using that as the basis. There's no problem with this. It's just curious because Paul doesn't do this with any of his other letters. So why is Second Thessalonians so similar in some respects? And this is another one. This man of lawlessness in Second Thessalonians, this rebellion, you know what's holding him back. Paul doesn't talk about this ever anywhere else in any of his writings. It's very curious. And if Second Thessalonians was at the beginning, like the traditional view says, surely this would pop up somewhere in his other writings. Now, it wouldn't have to. This is not, again, this is a cumulative case. It's not no one of these is a knockdown, drag out point. Lastly, why the cryptic? Why the almost code language? Wink, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You know what's holding him back. Don't you remember when I was with you? I'm not going to tell you because somebody's reading the mail, but don't you remember when I was with you? I used to talk about these things. Very curious. I've always found this very curious. And so An alternative hypothesis. Again, I do not hope to die for this. This is just the musings of a person who's read Second Thessalonians over and over and over the years, and the kind of simple hypothesis has never really satisfied. It just hasn't. There's just these other things that make me thinking, this is kind of curious here. So here is my hypothesis. What if Second Thessalonians is a bit of a code? The author, Paul, Silas, Timothy, or some variation of those three, and the audience, they know what's going on. We don't know what's going on, but it wasn't written to us, was it? We weren't. When Paul says, remember I used to talk about these things when I was with you? Nobody alive today is the YOU of that verse. Remember when I was with you, the Thessalonians? There's nobody alive on the earth today that Second Thessalonians was written to originally. Not the first meaning of that text. It's for us because it's scripture, but it was not written to us. And so we just don't know all the details of what's going on in this letter. Its audience did. I assume they did. So there's no deception going on here. There's no lying. It's not a forgery, nothing like that. But could it be that there's some code language going on here? The audience had the decoder ring. Unfortunately, we have to read between the lines a little bit. We do a little educated guessing. Now, again, maybe God wanted it that way. Maybe God is going to use Second Thessalonians as a template for the end times, and he's going to recycle it. It had a meaning for them that they knew, and it's going to have another meaning that will become clear when it all starts to happen at the end of time. Maybe we'll know when it happens. But if we're trying to figure out what the original code meaning was, we're going to have to do a little guesswork, and we probably will never know for sure, really. So here's some of what I mean by code language. You know what's holding him back, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But when he is taken out of the way, then, he'll come. What is he talking about here? This is a code. They know what he's talking about. Unfortunately, we don't. And of course, I hypothesized as we went through first the 3 chapters, we don't know what this is referring to. Could it be Paul? Could it be Paul himself? Could this be written while Paul is about to die at the hands of Nero? Those are the kinds of thoughts that go through my head. And of course, the verse, don't you remember? I used to tell you these things when I was with you. And again, I'm not saying this is true, but what if after Paul's death, Silas picks up 1 Thessalonians to write in a warning to the church in Paul's language, in Paul's words, because Paul has passed from the scene. Don't you remember when I was with you? I'm not anymore because I'm dead. Again, I'm not saying that's the case. These are the kind of scenarios that run through my head. Would that be lying? No, because they would know that it was Silas that was writing it, or Timothy. Those are hypotheses. There are other thoughts in my head. Silas is mentioned in 1 Peter 5, interestingly. I'll just leave it at that. Now, another curious thing is at the beginning of chapter 2, where it says, don't be disturbed by a letter or word coming, purporting to come from me. Now, we read past that and we think, yeah, it makes perfect sense that someone would forge a letter in Paul's name because Paul wrote a lot of letters. But remember what the standard scenario for 2 Thessalonians is, that it was written at the beginning of Paul's ministry. In fact, in my reckoning, if we go with that other hypothesis, the normal hypothesis, then 2 Thessalonians would be the second of the letters that Paul wrote. Paul would not at that time even be known as a letter writer. There would be no reputation of Paul as a letter writer. Why would anybody forge a letter in Paul's name that early in Paul's ministry? Whereas in the 60s, late in Paul's ministry, that might make some sense because everybody would know, Paul writes a bunch of letters. So again, I'm not saying this is the case, but these are some of the elements that have always kind of made me think, I wonder if more is going on here than meets the eye. So again, I don't even want to say I'm suggesting this. This is just the musings of a Bible scholar in his 50s. Could it be what I'm calling an apocalyptic letter? Now, okay, for those of you who don't like this language, I will readily admit that there is no such thing as an ancient genre called an apocalyptic letter, at least not that we would all agree on. There were apocalypses, but apocalypses are not apocalyptic letters. An apocalypse is more of a narrative kind of setup, not a letter. But what I'm calling an apocalyptic letter would be that there would be some situation in the 60s, either before Paul was dead, or there's the other hypothesis that it's Silas or Timothy not long after Paul's death. But let's say in the 60s, there is some situation involving an aggressor toward Israel and its temple. A man of lawlessness will set himself up in the temple as God. Now, the temple was destroyed in AD 70. So I think we can say with great certainty that 2 Thessalonians must have been written before AD 70, which again, that's not particularly controversial if you believe that Paul is the author, because of course Paul died in the 60s. Now we don't know exactly when Paul died. The time range for Paul's death ranges everywhere from 62, which is when Paul would have died if he died at the end of Acts, to say 68, which is when Nero committed suicide. We believe, according to tradition, and this is a tradition I see no reason to doubt, that Nero put Paul to death. And so we have that range from 62 to 68 as a possible time for Paul's death. Now, if Paul was freed at the end of Acts, and if he went on a fourth missionary journey and then appeared before Nero again a second time later on, then we have the years from 66 to 68 when potentially Paul could have appeared before Nero after the Jewish War had begun. Now, the Jewish War began in 66, and we might say it ended in 72 if we date its end to the defeat of Masada, or we could say it ended in 70 when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. But we definitely have a man of lawlessness in the person of Nero, and so we have Nero who was an aggressor against Israel in the Jewish war. Yes, Vespasian was the guy who was fighting the war from 60 to 68, and Vespasian would eventually become emperor in 69, at the end of 69, I believe. But at the beginning of the Jewish war, Nero would have been the Roman emperor behind the curtain, with Vespasian the actual aggressor. But anyway, this context of the Jewish war, which ended in the destruction of the temple, and of course it seems to me, Mark 13, there are a lot of resonances between 2 Thessalonians 2 and Mark 13, which talk about the abomination that causes desolation, which is in Mark 13 a prediction that the temple will be desecrated. And so there's plenty of precedent and background for thinking that there would be a Roman emperor or a Roman general who would defile the temple. There was plenty of background for that. And I talked about this in my treatment of 2 Thessalonians 2. We know of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, who ordered the temple to be defiled, and it was. That was the beginning of the Maccabean crisis. Pompey, the Roman general, walked into the Holy of Holies in 63 BC and defiled the temple. The Roman Emperor Caligula tried to defile the temple in AD 38. This would have been fresh on the minds if you're thinking about what did Jews remember in the mid first century. The attempt of Caligula to set up a statue of himself in the temple would have been very much in the recent mind of Jews in the mid first century. And then, of course, I've mentioned the Jewish war that ends up with the defiling of the temple. So these are very poignant background images for the idea of a man of lawlessness who would set himself up in the temple as God. And so my number one candidate for who Paul has in mind here in 2 Thessalonians 2 is a Roman emperor or a Roman general. Now, it could, of course, have been a Jewish figure as well. It could have been some leader of the Jewish side in the Jewish war, or it could be the high priest, I suppose, could be a messianic figure. I don't know of such individuals really in the Jewish war that would come to mind, but it is at least in theory possible that a Jewish man of lawlessness could have been in mind, or messianic pretender. I don't know. But the one that comes most to mind is some sort of Roman aggressor. And so the idea would be that Paul or Silas or Timothy, that they're the author. Paul could be the author before he dies, or Silas slightly after he dies, in the 60s. In other words, some 15 plus years after 1 Thessalonians, is going to write a code letter to the church about their current situation, but drawing upon 1 Thessalonians, using the voice of Paul's letter to the Thessalonians as a template for speaking to their current situation. Now, I should pause here. If this sounds strange to you, you may not know anything about the genre of the apocalypse that I mentioned. Apocalypses typically talked about current events through the voice of some dead individual, famous dead individual from the far distant past. So, for example, there are books of Enoch that we have in which we can often date the parts of Enoch fairly well. So, like there's a chapter in First Enoch that is sometimes called the Apocalypse of Weeks, in which history is divided into 10 weeks. Now, in the Apocalypse of Weeks, we get the impression that Enoch is prophesying about the distant future. But we know when the Apocalypse of Weeks was written because the history follows history very well until it gets to the time of the author. We know when you can often date an apocalypse very well because the prediction goes very well until it gets to the time that the actual document is being written. And so this is the way apocalypses tended to work. Now, Revelation doesn't work that way. By the way, next week I plan to start Revelation 1. The book of Revelation doesn't follow the typical prophetic model of a Jewish apocalypse, but these were around. So the idea of speaking about your current situation by using a voice from the past, there's Jewish stuff like that, lots of Jewish stuff like that. It would be like if I were to write a book about, or if I were to write a story in which John Wesley prophesies about the Methodist Church today. It would go something, you do something like this. I, John Wesley, was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I saw a vision of the people called Methodists of hundreds of years from now, that they will have a fight, and that it will become tense, and they will divide, and they will split into two different churches. Anyway, that would be kind of what we're talking about here. And so again, this is just brainstorming a hypothesis. What if Paul takes 1 Thessalonians or Silas and crafts 2 Thessalonians out of 1 Thessalonians to speak to a current event situation going on in the 60s? And so 1 Thessalonians gives form to a word about a current situation, a similar situation, but a different situation. And it would make sense because 1 Thessalonians is about end times, and 2 Thessalonians is also about end times. And so in this theory, it wouldn't actually be written to the literal Thessalonians, although it's written to them as well. But the Thessalonians would become a cipher, as it were, for Christians everywhere in this time in which the man of lawlessness was moving against Israel and God's people. And so, again, I'm not going to die for this. In fact, this is just my latest attempt to muse my way into understanding this very cryptic letter. And so the man of lawlessness would be based on probably Nero, I'm guessing, could be Vespasian, but probably some type of a Roman aggressor against Israel, someone who would set himself up in the temple of God as God in the same way Caligula wanted to, in the same way Pompey kind of did, in the same way the temple was defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes, and of course, eventually, after Vespasian becomes emperor, his son Titus will desecrate Jerusalem. Of course, I also mentioned it could be a Jewish figure, a revolutionary, or the high priest. That doesn't make as much sense to me, but could be. What is the rebellion then? What is the falling away? Well, the rebellion could be the Jewish revolt against the Romans, or, interesting enough, you could think of the Romans as a fight as the rebellion against the Jewish people. Again, could be right, could be wrong, don't know. But again, I'm thinking here of a date for 2 Thessalonians that's somewhere in between 66 and 70. That's basically what I'm talking here. Now, here's the part that I find hardest to fit into this scenario, because it seems to talk about the man of lawlessness performing signs and wonders, and people believing the lie. And so now there were, of course, the myth of the return of Nero. You hear about that sort of thing. There's a Jewish writing called the Sibylline Oracles that dates from I think later in the 1st century, that part that look to the return of Nero, and see him kind of, Revelation talks about one of the 5 kings having a mortal wound and yet him living. One gets the impression that Nero becomes a type of the kind of the beast, a type of the Antichrist, if you would, although that word is not used in Revelation. But anyway, difficult to know what this means. Of course, defeating Israel is a wonder. Who is believing the lie? Is it Jews who are believing in the lie? Because it'd be hard for me to believe that Jews would believe that Nero or Vespasian or Titus was supposed to be in the temple. That's where the idea of it is it some Jewish revolutionary claiming to be the Messiah or Jewish high priest. But then it occurs to me that it doesn't actually say that the people believing the lie are Jews. Could be Gentiles believing the lie. Gentiles believing that the Roman emperor or the Roman general is of God, and so forth. Well, ultimately, it's possible, and some of you were here. Some of you may now say, "Well, Ken, I was here before you even started this video. You've wasted my time." It's of course possible that we are seeing, as we do in Mark 13, that there is some blurring here between Paul's day and the end times. It may very well be that the reason why some of this is so cryptic is because it's not all about the 1st century, that some of this may relate to the second coming, which of course it does talk about the second coming, right? And remember, Mark 13 was the same way. Mark 13 begins clearly referring to the temple of that day. Most of the chapter, the context of the chapter, is about the temple that was already destroyed. And yet when we get toward the end of the chapter, it clearly talks about the second coming. And so it's possible that 2 Thessalonians 2 also does a little bit of that it starts by talking about events in Paul's day, and then at the end blurs into the second coming. And of course, if you know the Left Behind series or the old late great Planet Earth of Hal Lindsey, both of them believe, and John Darby, I think as well, in the 1800s, believed that the temple would be rebuilt, and that an Antichrist would set himself up in the temple as God. That the temple that Mark 13 and I would say 2 Thessalonians 2 are initially talking about is the temple that was destroyed in AD 70. But who knows? Maybe I will have to sit in the corner with a dunce hat on in heaven or in the kingdom, because in fact the temple will be rebuilt, and in fact there will be an Antichrist who sits. Maybe it's difficult because 2 Thessalonians 2 seems to be written to people in the 1st century, and yet some of it doesn't quite add up to our understanding. So I'll leave it like that. I don't claim to have come up with the silver bullet to 2 Thessalonians. However, I have put forth a hypothesis that at least would help us understand some of the enigmas and curiosities of Second Thessalonians. If it was helpful, great. If it wasn't, spew it out of thy mouth. Well, next week we'll start Revelation chapter 1 and go where angels fear to tread. But this has been the background of Second Thessalonians as we finish up this week's Through the Bible in 10 years.